Don't interrupt me. Didn't I just say that? And if you'll just listen are just a few words that we need to teach our women and young girls to know. Our culture has grown in many positive ways, but is also lacking in a few ways, such as women's speech. Male speech dominance is an issue that is continuously on the rise and needs to be put to a halt. Today, I will talk to you about how we are raising our girls to be subservient, how men interrupt women, and finally, how we are socialized to think that women talk more. Male speech dominance begins with the way girls are taught. As a young girl, you're told act like a lady, to be polite and not interrupt. While boys, on the other hand, they're just being boys if they interrupt and speak when they're not supposed to. Soraya Chamale, who has recently written an article published on HuffPost Women, states that parents are 2 times more likely to interrupt their child if they have a daughter and are also much more strict on their girls, as many of you probably know. Teachers are also more likely to be patient with boys if they interrupt and speak when they're not supposed to, because that's just how they're wired. Well, that in fact is not the case. We are the ones who are teaching our boys that it's okay to talk when other girls are talking, and that girls just need to accept it if a boy speaks over them. If we don't change the way we are raising our future women, we will never see equality in our workplaces or social circles. Now let's talk about how men interrupt and undermine women. Mansplaining. This is a word that was created by Rebecca Solnit and is defined as when men grant their speech more importance over a woman's. An example used in Soraya Chamale's article, 10 Words Every Girl Should Know, spoke of a man and Rebecca at a bar. He engaged in conversation with her and asked what her occupation was, and as she explained to him that she was a writer, and she couldn't even get the first word out to explain what her book title was because he interrupted her and said, well, now have you heard about the new book recently published? And he gave the title. Now, if he would have listened, he would have heard that this woman was actually the writer of the book that he deemed very important. So it's a little ironic that if he would have just listened, he would have known. And so not only did he interrupt her, he then nodded off when she explained it was her who had written the book, as if he didn't want to acknowledge that a woman has written his most favorite book. Now let's talk about my favorite example, as when there is no excuse to not acknowledge a woman's knowledge. Barbara Barnes was a female at MIT, and was told by her math professor that her boyfriend must have solved the math problem because there's no way that she could have done it. Several years later, after her gender transformation into a male, now Ben Barnes gave a scientific speech that Barbara previously gave just to see if there was a difference in male perception. Sure enough, a member of the audience said, oh, his work is much better than his sister's. So these men in the audience were so set on discrediting women that they were unaware that Ben said exactly the same words as Barbara. Now, but it was much more important because Ben said it and not Barbara. Ben then commented that his favorite part of now being a male is that he can finish his sentence without being interrupted. If those 2 first-hand experiences weren't enough for you, let's talk about an experience done by Kieran Schneider, and it was done just to see how often men speak over women. In his tech company, 60% of the speakers in any room were men, while 40% of them were women. Throughout the 900 minutes of conversation, 314 of those minutes were based on interruptions. The men he observed interrupted twice as often as any woman did. Now, some of you may think, well, that's because this is a tech place and there's more men there. That's actually wrong. Christina Pazanisi is a Harvard staff writer and says that women in 2014 were more likely to have a bachelor's degree than any men since the first time since 1940 statistics were collected. In fact, since the 2005-2006 academic year, women have received the majority of bachelor's, master's, and doctoral degrees nationally, according to the National Center of Education Statistics. Now that I have given you a few examples and statistics of how men interrupt women, let's finish with the greatest misconception. It is untrue that women talk more than men. We have all either been taught or have been around the theory that women speak more, and that we also assume that when women are in groups, they talk of senseless things. A study found that Scientific American concluded that the average words spoken by both male and females were relatively the same. The only difference is that women like to talk more about social things and things that are happening in their lives, and they like to explain more, while men who talk equally as much talk about more concrete things, objects, things that are happening to them in the now. To avoid our future women from becoming a stereotype or to have their words as thought to be powerless, we need to teach them to speak up and to actually talk like a man. This meaning they need to be able not to fear negotiating or demand higher pay for when not equal amongst other male employees doing the same work. Today I've spoken to you about how we teach girls to be subservient, how men interrupt women, and finally the stereotype of women talking more than men. Now, if you still believe that socialized male-dominant speech is not an issue, I challenge you to listen in on any conversation, whether it's group or not, and pay attention to how often men interrupt, deem their words more important, and even repeat what a woman previously said. If that isn't enough for you, think personally to what if it was your daughter. Would you want her to be passed over? Thank you.
All right, the subject is clear. I like the attention device that you used with the phrases that you've got at the beginning. The proposition, you identify a proposition at the beginning, but it's not very clearly highlighted, and I'm not sure that it's as distinct as it ought to be. The content's the same sort of thing. I do know that it's there. You do structure things. They're not always phrased as declarative statements. Sometimes, and that's a problem that I see in a lot of sections in the speech, is that you've got a lot of descriptive material instead of inferential material. So you're describing a particular phenomena. What we need is a little bit more information to be able to make a generalization. I like the examples that you have, but then the question becomes, are those examples something that we can generalize from? Are they typical or representative? At the end of the speech, for instance, you kind of give this recommendation, think about the next conversation that you're having and pay attention to all those kinds of things. Well, it's Tuesday night. That's Taco Tuesdays. My daughter's husband is going out to his friends to have Taco Tuesday, which means that she's at our house for dinner tonight. If I get a word in edgewise, I would be amazed. All right? So, but that's an exceptional example because she is a very verbal woman who is very assertive and forceful and has a father, somebody who is just, full of himself and willing to talk a lot, which she learned to be able to do, that kind of thing. So the question is, are we looking at something that is typical and generalizable? And I think we need a little bit more statistical data on some of those points. Having taught interpersonal communication, I know a lot of the things that you're talking about. There are patterns that go on there, and some of the generalizations that you're talking about are true. The way people are perceived differently and the expectations that folks have of others. I just need some data to back those things up. Like you challenged on that last point the notion that women talk more than men, and you've got a study that you cite on that particular point. And I thought there's a good example, although that example is a little abstract because you say, in general, there's not a significant difference. Well, wait a second. That suggests that there is a difference, but it's not significant. So that's the first, warning sign I'm going off there. Okay, well, how big a generalization are we dealing with here? And there's not more detail in that research. And that's some of the stuff that I think you need to put a little bit more of into the speech. Nothing that was problematic in the presentation. Everything was, I think, very solid. Just some things that could be a little bit stronger. All right. Thank you.